The pendulum clock in our hallway had been stopped at 6:12 p.m. for as long as I could remember, 25 years, give or take. Arthur used to say time behaved better when it was still, like a dog that only listened if you didn't call its name. Every evening, the light from the front window would catch the brass weights just so, and I'd imagine them breathing, waiting for permission to move again. The day Arthur died, time didn't wait. He was repairing the mayor's pendulum clock downtown, a grand old thing that had presided over Savannah weddings and council meetings and quiet arguments for more than a century. Spanish moss hung low outside the office windows, swaying like tired thoughts. Arthur loved that clock. He said it had a soul. I suppose that's why he was bent over its open chest when his own heart finally gave out. No sound, no drama, just a man and a machine holding their breath together. By the time I arrived, the clock had started again. The funeral came 3 days later. Savannah knows how to mourn slowly. The air was thick with humidity and memory, the cobblestones slick beneath black shoes. Inside the chapel, antique fans hummed overhead, stirring the smell of lilies and old wood. People spoke to me softly, carefully, as if I were made of glass. They told stories about Arthur I didn't recognize, a visionary, a pillar, a man who understood legacy. Legacy, that word echoed uncomfortably. I stood there nodding, my hands folded like I'd practiced this moment in front of a mirror. But every story felt slightly off, as though they were all describing the same portrait from different angles, and none of them matched the man who shared my breakfast table. Then the stranger approached. He was older, neatly dressed, his face familiar in the ways Savannah faces often are, seen but never placed. He didn't offer condolences. He simply took my hand and pressed a small antique key into my palm. It was warm, as though it had been waiting for me. "Every moment has been charged," he whispered. Before I could ask what he meant, he was gone, absorbed into the quiet shuffle of mourners and memories. That night, alone in the house, I stood before our silent clock. The house felt different without Arthur's breathing in the next room. Louder. The tick that never came seemed to shout. I held the key up to the light. It was old, iron, hand-cut, the kind that belonged to secrets, not doors. At exactly 6:12 p.m., the sun dipped low enough to cast a golden line across the clock face. My hands shook as I touched the glass. For the first time in decades, I felt something shift inside me. Not grief, not yet, but suspicion. Why had the clock stopped then? Why did everyone speak of my husband as if I'd only rented him? Over the following days, cards arrived, calls were made, and with each conversation, the picture of Arthur grew stranger. Men thanked me for his sacrifices. Women squeezed my arm and said, "You must be proud." Proud of what, I wondered? Of a life I thought I understood? I began to realize something unsettling, that the man I loved may have been living by a different clock altogether. That night, as cicadas sang outside and the air pressed in through the open windows, I placed the antique key on the mantel beneath the frozen pendulum. For the first time since Arthur's passing, I allowed myself to whisper the question that frightened me most. What had my husband been charging while time stood still? The next morning, Savannah wore its prettiest disguise. Sunlight slid across the antique cobblestones like melted butter, warm, almost comforting. The live oaks along Bull Street held their Spanish moss like lace shawls, and the city seemed to insist that life would continue exactly as it always had. But inside me, something had shifted. Grief had moved aside, making room for a sharper feeling, the kind that keeps your eyes open even when you want to look away. I carried Arthur's death certificate in my purse like a stone. At the bank, the air conditioning hit me hard, too cold for a city built on heat and humidity. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and printer ink. Behind the counter, a young man greeted me with a practiced smile, the kind you give strangers you hope won't cry. "I'm here to update my accounts," I said quietly. "My husband has passed." His smile faltered, then returned in a softer shape. He asked for my identification and a few documents. I handed them over, steadying my hands against the counter. For a moment, I imagined this would be simple. A painful errand, yes, but straightforward. Arthur and I had built our life carefully. We were not reckless people. We paid our bills, we planned for our children, we kept our promises. The young man typed, clicked, and frowned. "I'm going to have my supervisor come out," he said. That sentence is always a warning, even when spoken politely. A woman in her 50s appeared a minute later. Her hair was the color of silver coins, and she wore reading glasses on a chain like a small badge of authority. She introduced herself as Miss Hensley and offered me a private office. The door shut with a soft finality. She sat across from me, folded her hands, and looked at me the way people look at a storm forming over the river, with caution. "Mrs. Sullivan," she began, then paused. "Or Mrs. Winslow." I blinked. "I'm Clara Winslow. I kept my maiden name." She nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the screen. "I understand. The account notes show a durable power of attorney filed 5 years ago. It granted Mr. Sullivan, Arthur Sullivan, authority over several assets connected to your name and social security number." My mouth went dry. "That's not possible." She slid a document across the desk. It was crisp, official, and cruelly ordinary. At the top, in bold letters, it read "Durable Power of Attorney, State of Georgia." Beneath it was my signature. I stared at the ink like it might rearrange itself if I looked long enough. The loops and slants were unmistakably mine. My hand had written those letters. My name sat there, calm and obedient, as if it had never belonged to a woman who questioned anything. "I don't remember signing this," I said. Miss Hensley's expression tightened, not unkindly, but firmly, like someone who learned the difference between sympathy and policy. "In Georgia," she explained, "a durable power of attorney can remain valid even if the principal, meaning you, becomes incapacitated later. It allows the agent, your husband, to act on your behalf. It's called durable because it doesn't end if health declines, and it can be broad." Broad. That word landed in my chest. I read the clauses with a growing sickness: authority to manage accounts, transfer property, sign documents, take loans, adjust titles. It was all there. Neat paragraphs that translated my life into permissions, the kind of permissions you don't notice until someone uses them. "And he used it?" I asked, my voice thin. Miss Hensley hesitated, then turned the screen slightly so I could see. Numbers, transfers, lines of activity I had never seen on our household ledger, withdrawals, payments to companies with names that sounded like law firms or investment groups, and in the corner a note: "Client has agent authorization on file. All requests approved." Approved. By my own hand, apparently. My stomach rolled. I pressed my fingertips to the edge of the desk, grounding myself. "But Arthur wouldn't—" I started, and then I stopped. Because the truth was, I didn't know what Arthur would do anymore. Not after the funeral, not after the stranger and the key, not after the way mourners spoke of him as if he'd been leading some private parade through our quiet marriage. Miss Hensley leaned forward. "Mrs. Winslow, I'm not accusing anyone, but I need to be clear. If you're saying you don't remember signing, you may want to speak to an attorney who understands George's power of attorney laws, because as it stands, the document is valid." Valid. It was a simple word, but it felt like a door locking. I took the paper in my hands, and suddenly I remembered my mother's death 5 years ago, how the world had blurred around the edges for months, how I'd signed condolence cards without reading them, how I'd nodded through conversations like a woman underwater. Arthur had handled everything then. He told me to rest, told me not to worry, told me he'd take care of it. I stood slowly, my knees unsteady. Outside the bank, Savannah's heat wrapped around me again. The Spanish moss swayed, tourists laughed, carriages rolled past like a scene from a postcard. And I walked to my car holding proof that someone, my husband, my love, my protector, had been granted the legal right to steer my life without my awareness. When I got home, the pendulum clock greeted me with its silent face. 6:12. I placed the bank document beside the antique key on the mantel, and for the first time, I didn't feel only grief. I felt betrayed, in the quietest, most terrifying way. Because if Arthur had been acting as me, then what else had he done, while I thought I was safe? By the third day after the bank, I stopped calling it confusion. Confusion is soft. It's harmless. It lets you believe the answer will be simple once someone explains it the right way. What I felt was sharper than that. A kind of waking up that made ordinary things look suspicious. The creak of our porch swing, the click of the kitchen clock, the way Arthur's tools still lay neatly on the workbench, as if he'd only stepped out for coffee. Savannah, meanwhile, kept performing its usual magic. The mornings were drenched in pale gold, and the air smelled of damp brick and gardenias. Spanish moss hung from the oaks like slow tears. I walked the same streets I'd walked for years, but now every antique shop window and every historic plaque felt like part of a story I hadn't been allowed to read. That's when the notice arrived. It came folded into an official envelope, the paper thick and cold against my fingertips. I stood by the front door and read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might change if I stared hard enough. Notice of foreclosure proceedings, property at 214 Waters Avenue. My family home. Not the house Arthur and I bought together, not the little townhouse we lived in now. The home that belonged to my mother and her mother before her. The house where my childhood height was marked in pencil along the pantry doorframe. The house where my father taught me how to hold a hammer properly, where my mother taught me how to fold linens like they mattered. The house I'd promised my children would remain in the family. My knees weakened, and I steadied myself against the doorframe, the paper trembling like a living thing. The notice mentioned missed payments, default terms, and a sale date scheduled if the debt wasn't resolved. Debt? We didn't have debt like that. We had bills, sure. We had ordinary life expenses, but foreclosure? On my mother's house? I drove there immediately. The neighborhood was one of those Savannah pockets that looked like it stepped out of a sepia photograph. Small historic homes, iron fences with vines climbing them, porches with rocking chairs that seemed to remember every conversation ever held on them. The air felt heavier there, as if the past held on to the streets. My mother's house sat exactly as it always had. Pale paint, wide porch, shutters that needed sanding, but on the door was a tag from a legal office, tucked like a warning under the brass knocker. I stood on the porch and swallowed hard. Then I did what grief had been trying to keep me from doing. I searched. Inside, the house smells like dust and old cedar. I'd kept it mostly untouched since my mother passed, visiting often, tending the garden, dusting the mantels. It was my way of keeping her voice in the walls. I moved carefully through the rooms, listening to the boards creak under my feet like they recognized me. In the back study, where my mother once wrote recipes on index cards, I found a filing cabinet. Arthur had been there. I could tell. The top drawer was slightly out of alignment, as though someone had closed it quickly without care. My heartbeat drummed in my ears as I pulled it open. Folders, neatly labeled, too neatly. Preservation Initiative, Neighborhood Restoration, Funding Disbursements. My breath caught. These weren't my mother's papers. They were Arthur's. I sank into the old desk chair and flipped through documents that smelled faintly of ink and urgency. There were contracts, invoices, and letters from local organizations. There were line items for repairs on buildings I recognized, historic storefronts downtown, a small church on the edge of the district, even a crumbling row of workers' cottages. And there, in black and white, was the truth. Arthur had taken out loans using my name, secured by my family property, to finance a neighborhood preservation project. Not for himself, not for lavish living or secret indulgences, for Savannah, for the old bones of this city he loved more fiercely than I'd ever realized. The project's name appeared again and again, the Heritage Lantern Initiative. And then I found the letter that made my hands go cold. It was from a local oversight committee, formal, cautious wording, explaining that the initiative had been suspended due to irregularities, misallocated funds, and concerns raised by multiple parties. Suspected corruption. That phrase hovered on the page like smoke, never fully naming what it meant, but heavy enough to stain everything it touched. I pressed the heel of my hand to my mouth, trying to steady myself. My mind whirled with images of Arthur, my Arthur, standing in old buildings with his tool belt, smiling at a repaired window frame, admiring a restored clock tower. He always said history was fragile. He always said it needed caretakers. But caretaking shouldn't require betrayal. The foreclosure notice suddenly felt less like paperwork and more like a cliff edge. If I didn't act, my mother's house would be gone. My children's heritage would be sold to strangers. The roots of my family, everything my mother had preserved for me, would be severed. I walked out onto the porch and stared at the street. Savannah's breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Spanish moss swayed like pendulums in slow motion. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang softly, as if reminding me time still moved whether I wanted it to or not. Arthur had tried to save pieces of the city by risking the one thing I couldn't replace. And now, standing on that porch with a foreclosure notice in my purse and Arthur's secret files in my arms, I felt something new rising beneath the grief. Not just betrayal, but a terrible, dawning understanding. Love, I realized, can still ruin you if it comes with hidden signatures. And I hadn't even found the bottom of what he'd done yet. The first postcard fell out of Arthur's old leather satchel like a leaf that had been pressed too long in a book. I was sitting at our kitchen table, the one with faint knife marks from decades of Sunday roasts and children's school projects. The afternoon light in Savannah has a particular softness. It turns dust into glitter and makes every room feel like it's holding its breath. I'd brought the satchel home from his workshop because it still smelled like him. Oil, old wood, and the faint, peppery scent of his aftershave. I told myself I was looking for practical things, receipts, notes, anything that could help me untangle the foreclosure nightmare. but grief has a way of disguising curiosity as responsibility. The postcard was sun-faded at the edges. On the front, a photograph of the Everglades at dusk, water like dark glass, sawgrass stretching forever, a pink sky bruising into purple. On the back, Arthur's handwriting, small and precise like clockwork, filled the space. No "wish you were here," no "miss you." Instead, a list of numbers, a reference code, and a line that chilled me. Final notice enclosed. Payment required to avoid acceleration. I blinked, reread it, and felt my heartbeat thicken. This wasn't a message meant for my heart. It was a message meant for my wallet. I dug deeper into the satchel. More postcards, more envelopes, all Florida, all Everglades area addresses, all containing the same kind of cold language, terms and deadlines, interest rates, demands that grew sharper with each page. I stacked them like accusations. Some were labeled as coming from a private equity firm, the kind of company that sounds polished and respectable until you realize their kindness ends the moment you can't pay. The letters spoke in tidy phrases: asset-backed lending, heritage property financing, premium interest structure. Premium. Like grief could be upgraded. The interest rates made my stomach drop. The numbers didn't feel real at first, until I looked at the totals, until I saw the compounding effect, the way time itself had been turned into a weapon. My hand shook as I opened another envelope. This one wasn't about the house. It was about Arthur's watches. His watch collection had been the quiet heartbeat of our marriage. He'd started collecting long before I met him: pocket watches, wrist watches, antique clock parts, tiny gears stored in labeled tins. He treated them like family heirlooms. He used to say, "These will be for the children, Clara. Something solid, something that lasts." I believed him. Now, in black ink on white paper, I saw the truth. Collateral: full inventory of horological collection, including rare watch parts and antique timepieces, pledged against outstanding loan obligations. Pledged. He had mortgaged what I thought was our children's inheritance. I pressed my palm against my forehead, trying to keep my thoughts from scattering. The kitchen clock above the stove ticked steadily, indifferent. Outside, a carriage rolled past on the street, tourists laughing, the clip-clop echoing faintly like distant metronomes. I couldn't breathe properly. I searched for a single explanation that would make this feel less like the floor had disappeared beneath me. But the letters didn't soften. They didn't offer understanding. They only tightened their grip, each phrase a polite hand closing around my throat. Failure to comply may result in liquidation of secured assets. Interest accrues daily. Immediate action required. And then, at the bottom of one letter, a detail that made my blood run cold. Borrower, Clara Winslow. Authorized agent, Arthur Sullivan via durable power of attorney. There it was again. My name, his authority, my life signed away in ink I didn't remember. I pushed back from the table, the chair scraping the floor. My legs carried me down the hallway almost without permission. I stopped in front of our silent pendulum clock. 6:12. Always 6:12. I stared at the stopped hands and realized something that made the room tilt. Arthur hadn't just been hiding debts. He had been hiding a second life of paperwork, a life that ran parallel to ours, ticking behind the walls. Florida, the Everglades. Why there? I thought of the postcard's images: swamps and wide skies, places that look empty until you realize they're full of hidden movement, snakes underwater, birds in the reeds, life disguised as stillness. Maybe that's what Arthur had chosen, a place where secrets could breathe. I returned to the table and spread the letters out again, forcing myself to read more carefully. Some mentioned consultations, financial restructuring, specialized services. A few included clinic addresses, not banks, medical facilities, names that sounded like private testing centers. My throat tightened. Arthur had been going to Florida, not for pleasure, not for romance, not for escape, something else, something that required paperwork and money and secrecy. I gathered the letters into a neat stack, the way my mother taught me to handle overwhelming things, one pile at a time, one breath at a time. Then I pulled out a notebook and started writing down every company name, every address, every code. Because if Arthur had been borrowing against the watches and my family home, then the Everglades weren't just a destination, they were a clue. And somewhere inside those Florida addresses, beneath the glossy postcards and polished corporate language, was the reason my husband turned our marriage into collateral. Outside, Savannah's evening light turned amber. The Spanish moss stirred gently in the breeze, like slow pendulums, keeping time in their own quiet way. And I understood with a clarity that felt like pain. The debts weren't the end of the story. They were the beginning. Savannah has a way of offering answers in quiet places. Not in the bright, noisy corners where tourists gather for pralines and ghost stories, but in the shaded spaces where the city keeps its true heart. Places that smell like paper and rainwater, where time feels less like a threat and more like a companion. That's how I found the old chapter. It sat on a narrow street just off the busier squares, tucked between an antique lamp shop and a cafe that always smelled like cinnamon. The sign above the door was hand-painted, the letters slightly faded, as if the building itself preferred understatement. Through the front window I could see shelves packed close together, the spines of books pressed like shoulders in a crowded pew. I didn't go there looking for comfort. I went there because the foreclosure notice and those Florida letters had turned my home into a maze, and I needed someone who could read the map. A small bell chimed when I stepped inside. The air was cooler than outside, carrying the scent of old paper, lemon polish, and something faintly floral, lavender maybe. The light was soft, filtered through lace curtains. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, tall and dignified, its pendulum swinging steadily as if to prove that time could move without cruelty. Behind the counter was a woman with silver hair pulled into a loose bun, glasses perched low on her nose. She was reading something thick and serious, the kind of book that looks like it expects you to think. She looked up slowly, and her gaze met mine with a calm that felt earned. "Afternoon," she said. "You look like someone carrying more than a purse." I swallowed. My throat had been tight for days, as if my body was holding words hostage. "I'm Clara," I managed. I need help, not the kind you can find on a shelf." She studied me for a moment, then nodded toward a small table near the back. "Sit, breathe, and tell me what kind of help." Her voice wasn't pushy, it was steady, like a handrail. I sat. My purse thudded onto the table like it was full of stones. In a way, it was. Paper stones, ink stones, weight I didn't know how to carry. "My husband died," I began, the words tasting strange. "And now I've found things, documents, debts, a power of attorney I don't remember signing." At the mention of those words, power of attorney, her expression sharpened slightly, not with alarm, but with recognition. She pulled her chair closer. She said, "I'm Ruth, and before I owned this bookstore, I worked in civil administration for a long time. Not courtroom drama, not anything sensational, just the kind of work where paperwork can decide whether someone eats or loses their home." Her matter-of-fact tone made my eyes sting. I blinked hard, refusing to let tears take over. I didn't come here to fall apart. I came here to understand. I slid the documents across the table, the bank printouts, the foreclosure notice, the Florida letters. Ruth didn't gasp. She didn't flinch. She read like a woman who had learned not to be surprised by what people do when they're afraid. When she reached the line that named the durable power of attorney, she tapped the page gently. "This," she said, "is where your life got rerouted." "I didn't agree to it. I don't remember it." Ruth nodded. "Memory is not the only measure. Circumstances matter, capacity matters. And in Georgia, a durable power of attorney is powerful, but it's not untouchable if it was created under deception or when someone wasn't fully able to consent." Deception. That word landed softly, but it landed. She continued reading, her brow frowning when she saw the private equity letters. "These interest rates," she murmured, "they're not illegal on their face if structured a certain way, but they're predatory, especially when tied to heritage property. They count on people being emotionally attached to the home." I felt my chest tighten. My mother's house. Ruth looked up. "They're not just lending money, they're lending pressure." I exhaled shakily. The pendulum of the grandfather clock behind her kept swinging, steady and patient. It made me think of my own silent clock at home, frozen hands, trapped moment. The contrast felt cruel. Ruth stacked the papers neatly. "Clara," she said, "has anyone ever used the phrase financial infidelity around you?" I blinked. "No." She said, "It's when someone hides major financial decisions from their spouse, debts, loans, accounts, especially when it affects the household. It isn't about shame, it's about breach of trust." Breach of trust. That phrase fit my chest like a key sliding into a lock, not all at once, but enough to click. I stared at the papers again, seeing them differently now, not as random chaos, but as a pattern of concealment. A life Arthur lived behind my back, justified in his mind, maybe even fueled by fear, but still built on silence. "I keep thinking he must have had a reason," I said, my voice cracking. "Arthur wasn't cruel. He wasn't greedy. He loved history. He loved the city." Ruth's gaze softened. People can love something and still hurt the ones closest to them, especially sometimes then. Something in me sagged. It wasn't defeat, it was truth settling into place. Ruth reached into a drawer and pulled out a notepad. "Let's do this the right way," she said. "First, we list every debt, every lender, every deadline. Second, we look at the power of attorney, how it was executed, who witnessed it, what year. Third, we track these Florida addresses." I nodded, the first hint of direction cutting through the fog. Then Ruth paused, and her eyes flicked to one of the letters again. Not the bank one, not the foreclosure notice, but a page with a clinic heading. She turned it toward me. "This isn't just finance," she said quietly. "These are neurological testing facilities." The word neurological made my stomach drop. Arthur, Florida, the Everglades. My mind flashed to him at the kitchen sink, staring a little too long at the running water, to him misplacing his keys then laughing it off, to him repeating a story he'd told me the week before, exact same words, like a record skipping. Things I'd noticed and forgiven, because love makes excuses before it makes conclusions. Ruth's voice was gentle but firm. "Clara," she said, "your husband may have been hiding more than debt." My hands trembled as I reached for the letter. The numbers on it suddenly looked different, not just money, but desperation, not just bills, but fear. Outside, Savannah's afternoon sun slipped lower, turning the window glass amber. The bookstore felt like a pocket of stillness in a city that kept moving. And in that stillness, I felt the first true shift inside me. Not just the shock of betrayal, but the beginning of awakening. Because if Arthur had been spending tens of thousands on neurological tests, then his secrets weren't random, they were timed, planned, and like my silent clock at home, they were all pointing towards something that stopped long before his heart did. Ruth didn't let me drift in panic. She sent me home with a short list written in neat, no-nonsense handwriting. Find the original POA, locate witnesses, don't call the lenders alone, sleep if you can, and at the bottom, underlined twice, check the clock. As if it were that simple, as if a stopped pendulum could hand me the truth like a receipt. That evening, Savannah turned the color of old brass. The sun slipped behind the live oaks, and the Spanish moss outside our window swayed like it was counting down. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't answer calls. I moved through the house in soft socks, listening to the quiet where Arthur used to be. His workshop door was still slightly ajar. The smell of oil and sawdust lingered. On his bench sat a tiny screwdriver, placed carefully beside a magnifying lens, like he expected to return. I carried that ache down the hallway to our silent pendulum clock. It stood there like it always had, tall, solemn, and stubbornly paused at 6:12. For 25 years, I had treated it like decor, like an old family eccentricity. Arthur had insisted it remain untouched, saying it was temperamental, that he'd get to it one day. I teased him, and he'd smiled in that gentle way of his, as if the joke belonged to him too. Now I stared at it differently. I thought about the stranger at the funeral, the antique key, the whisper, "Every moment has been charged." My hands were cold as I picked up the key from the mantel. The metal felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried not just teeth and grooves, but intention. I examined the clock closely, its carved wood, its worn brass face, the glass panel that reflected my tired eyes back at me. I ran my fingers along the side seam where the casing met the back panel, and there, a narrow keyhole, hidden in the shadow between two carved vines. Arthur had known I wouldn't look. I slid the key in. It fit with a soft, decisive click. A section of the clock's side panel loosened, not swinging open like a door, but sliding back with the precision of a secret well practiced. Behind it was a compartment no wider than my hand, lined in dark velvet like a jewelry box. Inside sat a thin folder, wrapped in brown paper, and beneath it, a small cloth pouch that clinked faintly when I touched it. My breath caught. I unfolded the paper-wrapped folder first. The pages inside were crisp, legal letterhead at the top, highlighted lines and stamped dates. I flipped through them quickly at first, my eyes grabbing at words like lifeboats. Neurology clinic, cognitive assessment, PET imaging, early onset Alzheimer's disease. The room tilted. My knees went weak, and I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor beside the clock, the papers trembling in my hands. Early onset. I'd known Alzheimer's as something that visited late in life, like a slow winter, but this was a storm arriving out of season. Arthur had been diagnosed years. The dates were there in neat ink, time-stamped like a cruel joke. I read a line twice, then a third time. Patient expresses urgent concern about declining executive function and decision-making capacity. Executive function, decision-making. I swallowed hard as memory rearranged itself. Arthur misplacing things. Arthur repeating himself. Arthur staring too long at the ledger before balancing it. Arthur insisting on handling the complicated stuff. Arthur telling me, "Don't worry, Clara, I've got it." All those moments I'd softened with love, they sharpened into something else. I kept reading. There were notes about treatments that might slow progression, about support, about planning. And then I saw it, tucked into a doctor's summary like a warning. Recommendation: patients should not independently manage complex financial agreements. I pressed the paper to my chest and closed my eyes. He knew. He had known his mind was slipping, and instead of handing me the truth, steadily, respectfully, he had tried to outrun it. I reached into the clock compartment again and opened the cloth pouch. Inside were small items, an old wedding photo folded carefully, a tiny brass gear, and a handwritten note in Arthur's precise script. My hands shook as I unfolded it. Clara, if you're reading this, it means I ran out of time the way I feared I would. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to finish what I started before I forgot why it mattered. Savannah is built on what people choose to preserve. I thought I could preserve everything, even us. My throat tightened hard, it hurt. He kept writing, about the project, about the pressure, about men who promised funding and then pulled it away, about how he believed with desperate certainty that if he could just complete the restoration work, the city would rally, the donations would come, the debt would turn into legacy. And then the line that broke something open inside me. I did wrong things for what I told myself were right reasons. I used your name. I used your trust. I made choices that no decent husband should make. He didn't use the harsh words. He didn't have to. The meaning was there, quiet and heavy. The methods weren't just misguided. They crossed lines no love should cross. I sat there a long time, the stopped clock towering over me, its hands still fixed at 6:12, as if that minute had been the exact point Arthur decided to keep his fear to himself. Outside, Savannah's night settled in. Somewhere, far off, a real clock chimed the hour, steady and impartial. And in the hush of my hallway, with medical records in my lap and Arthur's confession in my hands, I finally understood the shape of my grief. It wasn't just losing my husband. It was realizing I'd been loving a man who was quietly disappearing, and who tried to save the world with the pieces of me. But even as the betrayal burned, something else rose through it, small, stubborn, and surprisingly clear. If Arthur's mind had been vanishing, then my life didn't have to vanish with it. And for the first time since he died, I felt the faintest spark of resolute, like a pendulum after years of stillness, preparing to move again.
Grief changes shape when you speak the truth out loud. I learned that the night my son came to dinner. Daniel arrived just after sunset, the porch light casting long shadows across the steps. He looked tired in the way men do when they carry loyalty like armor, upright, determined, and already bracing for a fight he doesn't yet understand. He kissed my cheek, hugged me a little too tightly, and glanced down the hallway toward the pendulum clock, as if expecting his father to step out at any moment. We sat at the kitchen table, where Arthur once mapped out his careful plans. I served soup neither of us really tasted. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until I placed the folder from the clock gently between us. "I found something," I said. Daniel frowned. "Mom, do we have to do this tonight?" "Yes," I replied softly, "because tomorrow I have to decide what kind of future I'm allowed to have." He opened the folder slowly. As he read, his jaw tightened. When he reached the diagnosis, early onset Alzheimer's, his breath hitched, just once, before he straightened again. "So that's it. You're saying Dad was sick, and now you want to drag his name through court." The words stung, even though I knew where they came from. Daniel had always seen Arthur as immovable, the steady hand, the moral compass, the man who fixed what others discarded. To question Arthur felt, to him, like questioning gravity. "I'm not dragging anything," I said. "I'm trying to survive what he left behind." He pushed the papers away. He was trying to do something good, preserve history, protect the city. People respected him. "I know," I said. "I loved him. That doesn't change." "Then why file anything? Why challenge the debts? Why involve the government? You'll make it look like he took advantage of you." I took a slow breath. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, the sound suddenly loud. "Daniel," I said carefully, "your father did take advantage of me, not out of cruelty, but out of fear, and love doesn't cancel consequences." His eyes flashed. "So you're just going to erase him? Pretend he wasn't the man we knew?" I reached across the table and laid my hand over his. "I'm not erasing your father. I'm separating him from the paperwork that's threatening to erase me." He pulled his hand back, standing abruptly. "There's a law firm downtown that offered to help manage things quietly. No lawsuits, no accusations. Just absorb the losses and move on. That's what Dad would have wanted." I stood too, my knees shaking but my voice steady. What your father wanted changed when his mind started failing, and what he needed was honesty, not silence. He stared at me, stunned. "You'd really use that law?" he asked quietly. "The one that says you didn't know? The one that makes him look deceptive?" I nodded. "Yes, because it's the truth." The innocent spouse provision wasn't something I'd ever imagined applying to my life. Ruth had explained it patiently, how federal law allowed a spouse to seek relief when debts or obligations were created without their knowledge or consent, especially when deception was involved. It wasn't about punishment, it was about fairness. I didn't sign up to lose my mother's house. I didn't agree to predatory loans, and I didn't consent to being managed like an asset. Daniel's shoulders sagged. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who believed parents were unbreakable. "He was sick," he said again, softer this time. "Yes, and I'm still alive." The words surprised us both. Outside, the evening breeze stirred the Spanish moss, setting it sway gently like slow pendulums. Time didn't stop for loyalty. It didn't pause for pride. It moved forward, demanding choices. Daniel looked at me for a long moment, then nodded once. "I don't agree, but I won't stand in your way." That was all he could give, and it was enough. After he left, I stood alone in the hallway, facing the silent clock. Arthur's face hovered in my memory. Not the secretive man, not the desperate one, but the husband who once told me marriage meant carrying weight together. This weight, though, was mine alone now. And as hard as it was, I understood something essential. Protecting a memory should never require sacrificing a living woman's future. I turned off the lights, leaving the clock in shadow, and for the first time, I didn't feel like time was my enemy. I felt like it was waiting to see what I would choose next. The morning of the hearing, Savannah felt unusually still, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The live oaks lining the square barely stirred, Spanish moss hanging in long, thoughtful strands. I walked slowly, my shoes tapping against the antique cobblestones, each step echoing louder than it should have. I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to remind myself who I was. A woman who had paid her bills, a daughter who had protected a home, a wife who had trusted and been asked to pay for it. The courthouse rose ahead of me, pale stone warmed by the Georgia sun. Inside, the air was cool and faintly smelled of paper and old polish. The hallway buzzed with low conversations, but I felt separate from it all, like I was moving through water. When I entered the courtroom, my heart thudded hard once, then settled. The judge sat high above us, composed and watchful. Across the aisle, the creditor's attorney arranged his files with practiced confidence. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man doing his job, which somehow made it harder. I sat at the wooden table beside Ruth, who gave me a small nod. Not encouragement, assurance.
The proceedings began with language that sounded clean and distant. Dates, amounts, clauses. My life reduced to numbered paragraphs. The attorney spoke about benefits derived, about shared marital standing, about how Arthur's work had brought visibility and prestige. Prestige. The word echoed hollowly. He argued that I benefited from my husband's reputation, that I lived comfortably while his preservation work elevated our standing in Savannah, that I should, therefore, share responsibility for the obligations incurred. When it was my turn, my knees trembled as I stood. The courtroom felt suddenly too quiet. I could hear my own breathing. I thought of my mother's house, of the clock stopped at 6:12, of the key in my palm. "I want to be very clear," I said, my voice softer than I expected, but steady. "I am not here to deny my husband's love for this city, or his intentions." The attorney shifted slightly. "But trust in marriage is not a blank check for one person to sign on the other's life." A murmur rippled through the room, quickly hushed. I explained how the durable power of attorney had been signed during a period when I was undergoing psychiatric treatment following my mother's death, how I had been grieving, medicated, and emotionally vulnerable, how I had no memory of signing away control of my assets, and how that control had been used to secure high-interest loans without my knowledge. I didn't accuse, I described. I spoke about the foreclosure notice on my family home, about the watch collection pledged as collateral, items promised to my children, about the neurological diagnosis Arthur had hidden, and the fear that had driven him to make increasingly reckless decisions. He was ill, I said, my throat tightening, and afraid, and he acted alone. The judge leaned forward slightly. I presented the medical records, the dates, the recommendation that Arthur should not independently manage complex financial agreements. I explained how secrecy, not partnership, had guided those decisions. "I loved my husband," I said quietly, "but love does not require blindness, and it does not require self-destruction." The attorney rose again, attempting to reframe, suggesting I had enjoyed the comforts of marriage, the security of Arthur's income, the social benefits of his work. I met the judge's gaze. "I enjoyed believing I was safe. There's a difference." The room fell silent. The judge took time. Pages turned, notes were made. The law moved at its own deliberate pace, indifferent to my racing heart. Finally, the ruling came, not dramatic, not triumphant, but measured. The court recognized my petition under the principles of innocent spousal relief. The debts incurred without my informed consent would be reviewed separately. Foreclosure proceedings on my family home were stayed. The validity of the power of attorney, given the circumstances, would be limited. I didn't cry. I simply exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Outside the courthouse, sunlight spilled across the steps. The Spanish moss swayed again, unburdened. Ruth touched my arm. "You did exactly what you needed to do," she said. I nodded, my legs unsteady, but my spine straight. Arthur's name had been spoken that day, not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a man, flawed, ill, loved. And I walked away from the courthouse understanding something profound. Justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like permission. Permission to live. Permission to rebuild. Permission to let the pendulum move forward, at last. I could have let the bank take the house. That was the quiet option, the one people kept suggesting in lowered voices, as if surrender were a form of dignity. Walk away, start smaller, forget the weight of inheritance. But I had spent too many nights listening to the silence of a stopped clock to choose disappearance. Instead, I chose something harder and oddly freeing. I chose to tell the truth out loud. The watch collection was the first decision. After the court ruling, I was granted limited authority over what remained. Boxes of parts, half-restored pieces, small wonders Arthur had loved but never finished. I laid them out on long tables in my mother's old living room, sunlight streaming through lace curtains. Gears, springs, faces without hands. Time dismantled into components. I didn't see clutter. I saw possibility. Before Arthur died, I had quietly handled appraisals for neighbors. Nothing formal, just a practiced eye and a respect for old things. Ruth encouraged me to trust that skill now. Together, we organized an auction, but not the kind held in hushed rooms for insiders only. This one would be public, transparent, honest. We rented a modest hall near the river, the kind of place where community meetings and school recitals happened. I wrote the listing myself, not just descriptions of the items, but the story behind them. I wrote about Alzheimer's, about fear and secrecy, about how love can twist when it's driven by urgency instead of openness. I expected resistance. What I received was something else entirely. People came early. Collectors, yes, but also neighbors, retirees, even a few local preservation volunteers who remembered Arthur's work. They moved slowly between the tables, touching pieces gently, asking thoughtful questions. Some listened when I spoke, some simply nodded, eyes soft with recognition. I stood at the front when the auction began, my hands clasped, my heart pounding. These items aren't just antiques. They're pieces of time and pieces of a story that wasn't told clearly enough. Today isn't about profit. It's about honesty. I didn't sell perfection. I sold truth. The bids came steadily, not frenzied, respectful, enough. When the final numbers were tallied, I sat alone for a moment, staring at the ledger. The total wasn't miraculous. It didn't erase everything Arthur had set in motion, but it was enough. Enough to resolve the tax obligations, enough to satisfy part of the remaining lenders, enough to keep a small portion of assets, and my dignity. More importantly, it was enough to feel like myself again. In the weeks that followed, letters arrived, different this time, softer, closing statements instead of threats. I framed one, briefly, then decided against it. I didn't need reminders of survival. I needed space to grow into it. One afternoon, as I locked up my mother's house, I realized something unexpected. I no longer felt like I was guarding a shrine. The house wasn't frozen in time anymore. It was alive again, waiting for its next chapter. That night, back at home, I stood in front of the pendulum clock. 6:12, still, but it no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a promise I had finally learned how to keep. I wasn't just selling antiques at that auction. I was releasing an identity built on silence, and in its place, I claimed something quieter, stronger, and entirely my own. Because healing, I discovered, doesn't always come from holding on. Sometimes it comes from choosing what you're finally willing to let go. The paperwork for a name change looks simple on the surface. A form, a filing fee, a few signatures. But when you've spent decades being someone's wife in the way the world labels you, gently, habitually, like a tag tied to your wrist, changing your name feels less like ink and more like reclaiming your breath. I stood at the counter in the records office downtown, the air smelling faintly of paper and floor polish. The clerk slid my documents back and forth with practiced speed, stamping dates as if time were nothing but a series of rectangles. "Ma'am," she said, "you're restoring your maiden name?" "Yes," I answered. And then, because I needed to hear myself say it clearly, I added, "I'm Clara Winslow again." The stamp came down with a firm thud. Outside, Savannah's sun warmed my shoulders. The Spanish moss swayed overhead, soft as a benediction. I walked slowly, letting the city's sounds wrap around me, distant church bells, footsteps on antique cobblestones, the low hum of life continuing without asking permission. That evening, I went back to my mother's house. I carried a small box of cleaning cloths, a jar of lemon oil, and a sense of purpose that felt unfamiliar and welcome. The rooms were quiet, but not empty. I opened windows, let the breeze move through. I dusted the mantel and touched the old pantry doorframe where my childhood height was still marked in pencil. Then I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the late light turn the street honey-colored. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for a phone call or a letter or a decision made by someone else. I was simply present. Ruth called the next day. "I've been thinking," she said. "We've had women coming into the bookstore asking questions. Older women, widows, divorced, some married and quietly worried. They don't need drama. They need clarity." I held the receiver to my ear, looking at the pendulum clock in my own hallway, still paused at 6:12 like a stubborn memory. "What are you asking me?" I said, though I already knew. Ruth's voice was steady. "Come work with me, not as a clerk, as someone who helps them understand their finances before their lives get signed away." A month earlier, I would have laughed at the idea. Me, a woman who had been blindsided by her own marriage paperwork, guiding anyone else. But now I understood something I hadn't before. You don't have to be perfect to be useful. You just have to be honest and willing to learn. So I said yes. The old chapter became more than a bookstore. It became a lighthouse for women who'd spent years navigating quietly, balancing households, caring for family, trusting someone else to handle things. We hosted small workshops at the back table under warm lamplight. We explained the basics, what a durable power of attorney can do, why reading every clause matters, how to ask questions without feeling ashamed. Sometimes I watched a woman's face change as she realized for the first time that she was allowed to protect herself. And every time, something inside me healed a little more. On a damp spring evening, I came home from the bookstore and stood again in front of my silent clock. I didn't have the urge to fix it anymore. Not yet. It had been Arthur's secret, and then it became my awakening. I traced the carved wood with my fingertips and whispered, not to him, but to the life I was building, "I'm not giving away the keys again." The next morning, I returned to my mother's house with a small toolbox. I wasn't Arthur. I didn't pretend to be, but I had watched him, learned beside him, loved him in the language of careful hands. I opened the clock's compartment one last time and removed the last of the papers. The medical records were already filed safely. His note was folded and placed in a keepsake box, where it could be held without hurting me. Then I looked at the clock face, 6:12, frozen for 25 years, and I made a decision that felt like forgiveness without forgetting. I set the hands forward, not back, forward. I didn't correct the past. I didn't try to rewrite it. I simply refused to live in it. That night, as the city's warm air drifted through open windows and the Spanish moss swayed like soft pendulums outside, I sat on my porch and let the future feel real. I thought of Arthur, not as a saint, not as a villain, but as a man who loved fiercely and feared quietly. I let myself miss him, and I let myself be angry. Both were true, but I didn't let either one decide my life anymore. Because this is what I know now, what I would tell any woman who has ever swallowed questions to keep the peace. Marriage needs love, but finances need transparency. Love can be tender and imperfect and still worth remembering, but your life, your name, your home, your future, those require clear eyes. Never hand over the keys to your life to anyone, even someone you love most, not without understanding exactly what the lock is. And if you've already done it, if you've already trusted too much, it isn't the end. Sometimes it's the first honest moment of your life. A stopped clock can be a warning, but it can also be a doorway. And when you finally choose to step through, the pendulum doesn't just swing, so do you. As storytellers at Heart Journal, we do not see this as only a personal tragedy, but a quiet mirror reflecting many lives beyond the screen. Clara's story reminds us of something essential. Love should never require giving up the right to understand, to ask questions, or to protect oneself. Many in our generation were taught to sacrifice, to trust without hesitation, and to let the other handle the big decisions. Yet time shows us that prolonged silence can become the soil where unseen fractures grow. Transparency does not weaken love, it shields it from fear, illness, and decisions made in desperation. At an age when many believe life is meant only for remembering, Clara chose to stand up again, not to deny her past, but to safeguard her future. That choice is a rare and deeply mature form of courage. We would like to ask you, the listener, have you ever trusted someone completely, only to realize later that you hadn't asked enough questions? Have you ever stayed silent about small signs, believing that family doesn't need to be so exact? If you feel ready, Heart Journal invites you to share your own story in the comments. Stories of marriage, family, finances, late awakenings, or lessons learned at the cost of time. With your permission, we may share these stories anonymously as human lessons for others, so that no one feels alone while walking through the hardest, most unspoken moments of life. Because sometimes your story becomes the key that helps someone else open their own door.